Let's bring in a guest now. William Lawrence is in Washington, D.C. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at American University. Welcome to you. Lots of things to unpack here, lots of different elements to any potential ceasefire. Let's start with Joe Biden's part in this. He sounds confident. He basically said himself just under a one-week deadline. He seems to be pushing hard for it. Why is Joe Biden pushing so hard now?
Well, there are many elements to it, as your other guest said, domestic and international. But to talk about the domestic part, he was in New York for a fundraiser, which includes both Jewish and Arab people who want a ceasefire, who he's raising funds from. He was doing a late night television show, which he'll surely be asked about it. And of course, the Michigan primary tomorrow. And he's very much under the spotlight because everyone's figured out that although the U.S. President isn't the only player in these negotiations, he plays more of a role than anyone else in forcing things towards a ceasefire. And when he says Monday, that matters. Let me also say that over the last 3 weeks, the main sticking point has been the formulas that your correspondent Mohammed started to talk about. And I didn't want to leave on the table the way Craig phrased it. I mean, everything Craig said was correct, but he sort of made it sound like we're swapping a ceasefire for hostages, when in fact the main sticking point for 3 weeks now has been how many Palestinians and which Palestinians get released. And the number we were hearing was 300. If it's gone up to 400, that sounds to me like we're closer to a deal. Of course, the 30 to 40 hostages that be released, we're talking about women, elderly, and wounded. But the first order of business after the exchange is the humanitarian catastrophe that's going on, the 400,000 starving Palestinians living amidst all this broken down infrastructure. And if I could add one point, when Netanyahu was doing the Sunday shows yesterday, as Jake Sullivan was doing, he was talking about the Rafa plan quite a bit, because the U.S. has said it will not sanction an operation in Rafa if there aren't acceptable safeguards for the approximately 1.4 million Palestinians in and around Rafa. And Netanyahu said that there's this two-step plan he asked his generals to come up with. He was going to see it yesterday. And the U.S. kind of has to approve that plan before anything happens in Rafah. And that's why Netanyahu was going back and forth and saying maybe a ceasefire, maybe not. But Netanyahu knows that there's two ways now to delay this Rafah campaign. And of course, the U.S. preference is not just phase one, 6-week ceasefire. It's 6 weeks, 6 weeks, and 6 weeks, phase 1, 2, and 3. That's their preference, and no Rafah campaign at all. But that's still not agreed to yet.
Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly said Hamas has to go, even if it's just a 6-week deal. Does it not look like he's sort of going back on his words if he then strikes some kind of deal with Hamas, saying they have to go, and then he's like, okay, we've come to some kind of agreement? Does it not weaken his position?
He's all over the place, and he's wordsmithing, and he says one thing to the Israeli public and something else to the Americans. So you do have to take everything that says with a lick of salt. I mean, just the way he's been talking about these diktats about a Palestinian state when no one even imposed one, and that has the Knesset vote on it, just shows the sort of games he's playing here. But there's no question that Israel doesn't need to have a ceasefire. But is being pushed to have a ceasefire in a way that could kind of work out for Netanyahu. I really believe that Netanyahu doesn't really care either way that much about the hostages. And in terms of defeating Hamas, there's many ways to defeat Hamas. But before he was talking about all kinds of things. Now he's talking about the 4 brigades, and he was using the word dismantling. So dismantling 4 brigades, that can be done under a ceasefire. I mean, it doesn't even have to be done as part of a war action. So if that's the new, very limited goal that he's telling the Americans they ought to agree to, that dismantling can be done under any set of conditions. I think the larger long-term issue is you can't run Gaza without a whole bunch of former Hamas cadres running it. It won't work. And so there'll have to be a kind of ex-Hamas or Hamas 2.0 that's brought forward to run the strip until future elections and future reorganizations. And don't forget, the resignation of the Palestinian government is part of all of this, because the revamping of the Palestinian Authority was one of the things the Americans asked the Palestinians to help with, and that began.
William, great to get your analysis. Appreciate your time. My guest, William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at American University.